CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome yet to another episode with me, Bheki Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment here at the West Business School. I'm so excited this morning to be joined by my brother, my friend, and a colleague, Briggs Bomba. Welcome.
Thank you, Becky. Very, very excited to be on your show, and congratulations for the great success of the program so far.
Thank you so much. It's not just me, but it's the team, as you can see them here. But I don't even know where to start. I mean, there's a long history between Briggs and I, and maybe let's start with the name Briggs.
Yes.
Where does that name come from? I know it's now part of your government name, but suspicion and assumptions are that it was never part of your government name. So let's talk about the name Briggs.
You know too much, Becky.
Yeah.
I have a background leading the students' movement in Zimbabwe. I was the president of the Student Representative Council at the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe. And it was a very intense moment of struggle for the right to education, and beyond that, the right to democracy, civil liberties. And I led that struggle at a moment where we really had to be a militant formation. So we were organized in that manner, and from the leadership that we gave to that struggle, that I assumed the title of a brigadier. So Briggs is basically short for brigadier. That's the shortest version of the story I can give you.
Yeah, and I think that title brigadier has actually followed you in different forms. It's not a military title anymore, but I think in the space that you are involved in activism. And maybe this is the moment for me to take us through some of your experiences and life journey. I think at some point I got to know a lot about your work when you were based in the United States of America. Maybe can we talk a bit about that time when you were in the US and some of the activities and some of the interventions that you were involved in, which led basically to the formation of the Zimbabwe Alliance.
Yeah. So when we led the struggles that we led as student leaders, it had very dire consequences. It was an important struggle because what we were fighting for was that education should be a right for every citizen and not a privilege for those who had money to pay for it. We were very firm in the conviction that education should be a right because we saw ourselves as the inheritors of a legacy of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, where access to basic rights such as education were at the center. And this is at a time when the government was adopting what are broadly known as neoliberal policies, which meant that government was cutting funding in education. They were introducing user fees, they were taking away grants, and a lot of students who were coming from poor families were actually having to go back home because they could not access this very basic right. And we knew that education, access to education, especially at this higher level, was the sure way to break out of the cycle of poverty and access a more dignified life, more access opportunities to livelihoods and things like that. So this was an extremely intense struggle that we fought. The government misunderstood this and took it as a challenge on its ability to retain power. So the reaction was extremely oppressive. We found ourselves getting arrested, getting abducted, activists getting tortured. It was a very, very difficult moment as the government was trying to stem the tide of these social protests and this insistence on our part that these were rights that were due to us as inheritors of the legacy of the liberation struggle and the sacrifices that all our forebearers had brought in. So I became part of that. If you go back into history, you will see stories of me spending 5 days in prison in Bulawayo, coming out with a broken hand. You will see stories of being arrested, being in Chitungwiza, the torture and all of that. All of that to say, at a certain point, I then had to leave and move to a different context. That's how I find myself in the US. I used that as an opportunity to also further my studies. So I was pursuing a master's in economics, some at a university in Ohio, but I remained very active and very engaged. And in that engagement, obviously we were focused again on the question in Zim, because from our time as student leaders, we had already understood that our task went beyond the sectoral issues that were boiling in the student sector or the education sector to a bigger question about democracy in the country, about economic justice in the country. So we remained involved at this bigger level. And when I was in the US, it so happened that you had solidarity actors from here in South Africa who were seeing our struggle, and they were saying we cannot leave our comrades to be silent voices and to be struggling alone. And this involved people like Kumi Naidu, and at that particular time, Kumi led a hunger strike or fasting marathon where each of them would fast for 21 days, and then they'll pass it on to the next person to raise awareness and attention to our struggle in Zimbabwe. So Kumi did the first marathon. He passed it on to Nomboniso Gasa, who a lot of people would know. She was the head of the Gender Commission here in South Africa. And Nomboniso came to Washington, D.C. Whilst she was on her fast. And as she came to Washington, D.C., she was, I think, like almost 20 days into the fast. She was this frail, thin woman, because she had not been eating for about 20 days. So when she came to D.C., we came together with a number of people to say, okay, how do we really present her in front of the solidarity community in Washington, D.C., policymakers in Washington, D.C., so that the message that she was trying to communicate has, the audience. So we came together with, at that particular time, Schooner Foundation. Cynthia Ryan was at the Schooner Foundation. And we were saying, what can we do together to really honor the sacrifice that people like, Kumi Naidu and Nomboniso had demonstrated in solidarity with the struggle in Zimbabwe. And we also wanted something that will be long-lasting, even beyond their fasting. So that's where the idea of saying, let's come up with a collaborative framework that will allow funders and civil society to work together in mobilizing resources towards the cause for change and transformation in Zimbabwe in a sustainable manner. And this is actually the origin story, if you may, of Zimbabwe Alliance. What I must add there is that the first step we took was to then convene a number of what we saw as critical actors to have a conversation on how do we go about it.
Yeah.
So we had Akwasi Aidu, who was the executive director of TrustAfrica then, coming to Washington, D.C. to sit in a meeting. We had a few selected civil society partners that we had already started to work with and support in Zimbabwe coming to Washington, D.C. We had the Wallace Global Fund, the family, as well as, when I say the family, I mean Scott Wallace, Christy Wallace, as well as Ellen Dorsey, the executive director at that time, coming to a conversation. We had a number of other actors coming to the conversation to say, how do we build a collaborative framework to mobilize resources so that we can support the struggle for democracy and rights and transformation in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, so I think, we will try and do a case study, as you know, of the Zim Alliance. And so I think the stories of Nomboniso, Kumi still deserve a bit of writing and sharing widely, because like you said, they were very instrumental and fundamental in the beginning of setting up of
inspiring
Zimbabwe Alliance. And also it speaks to issues of solidarity, which I hope we'll get to when we talk about social movements later. But let's move from, before we move from that point, I think at that point we were also working for a group in the US called Africa Action.
Yes,
can we talk a bit about
I was
your time there?
I was working for Africa Action because for me, by the time I moved to the US, the bug of activism had already stung. Right? So I was involved in so many progressive struggles. We were involved, primarily Africa Action's focus was on making sure that we influence US Africa policy. Our offices were like a walking distance from the White House and to the Capitol Hill. So we're constantly engaging the White House, we're constantly engaging members of Congress so that we can influence US Africa policy. We knew that if you left US Africa policy to the influence of corporations and some of the elected officials there, it would be counter-purpose to the social justice agenda. So we're very much engaged on that. And Africa Action is an institution that had a long history of solidarity with the anti-apartheid struggle here in South Africa, and including the whole agenda to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Africa Action was at the center of that. So I was the director of campaigns at that point, and these were campaigns that were now being formulated to say, in the post anti-apartheid struggle, there were still issues that were of concern when it comes to US policy in Africa. And it was US policy in Africa with regards to peace and security, with regards to public health. We were at the center of campaigning for the $50 billion that then George Bush invested in it became known as PEPFAR. But for us, we're looking at it broadly as global health, to say part of the obligation that the US had was to invest significant resources in advancing the global health agenda. We were big. One of our campaigns was on Sudan, Darfur, ending the genocide in Darfur, and generally anything. AFRICOM, we were part of that big campaign to stop AFRICOM from coming to Africa. So we generally invested in that agenda. But I wanted to say something, Becky, because it will be a huge omission if I also do not mention your own role, because you were the programs director at TrustAfrica at that particular time.
I want to come back to that.
So whilst we had these big ideas around this, I think you played a very significant role in making sure that we moved from a big idea to the actual realization of Zimbabwe Alliance as a collaborative framework that to date has mobilized millions of dollars into Zimbabwe from that time. Because you were very methodical in saying, okay, so this is now what we need to do. This idea needs a housing, and that housing is sustainable if it's an African institution, and that's how even TrustAfrica ends up becoming the host. So I think it will be a huge omission if I don't mention the role that you played.
So I wanted to come back to that and say, I think in all my grant-making life, one of the best moments was actually when you, Cynthia and co, came to TrustAfrica and asked if we could, house the Zim Alliance project as part of TrustAfrica's project, and we did that. And man, some of the grants that we made.
Yes.
So, but let's start there. So here you are now, leading Zim Alliance as a project under TrustAfrica, but with its own mandate and its own, a mandate, but also mission. And the first set of grants that we make was a set of grants that identified a couple of key stakeholders in Zimbabwe, your crisis coalition. I think there was one
Zimbabwe
in media
on debt and development.
So let's talk a bit about that initial set of grants.
Yeah, so when we make the first round of grants, there was a big opportunity that we were seeing in Zimbabwe. And the big opportunity was the constitutional reform process. If you go back to Zim post-2008 and the crisis that hit hard there, then the emergence of the inclusive government in 2009, there was an agreement that the country needed a new constitution to create a framework that would bring about stability and progress, shared progress for the country. So we saw that opportunity. And when we were coming into that opportunity, the first set of grants for Zim Alliance were looking at, first of all, how do we really take that as an opportunity to advance the agenda for civil liberties and democratic rights and codify it in the country's new constitution. So we worked with groups like Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition at that point to really make sure that in the outreach program, because there was a national outreach in different provinces, different districts, local communities, to consult people, that conversations were taking place that were really speaking to the centrality of this and soliciting and capturing citizens' input in terms of their aspirations around these very basic democratic rights and civil liberties. But we also knew that the crisis in Zimbabwe was not just about the civil liberties dimension, it was also about social economic justice and social economic rights. So we worked with groups like Zimbabwe Coalition on debt and development to go out and make sure that in the conversations and the consultations that were taking place, this issue of social economic justice would be at the center. So if you then see the conversations and the discourse that emerged around the new constitution, in our view, it became balanced in that sense. But very importantly, because we were at a moment where there had been so much, the movements had been so battered, some of our best brains had left the country because they were losing even hope that change was possible, we brought in a very significant intervention where we said one of the things that was needed was technical anchorship and technical support to ensure that at the end of the day we have a constitution that reflects some of the best insights and best democratic practices globally. So working in particular with the Wallace Global Fund, we put together a framework that brought in constitutional experts, it brought in researchers, it brought in multidisciplinary actors into a technical team that was supporting the drafting of the new constitution.
Yeah. And
through that framework, we actually managed to convince someone of the stature of Professor Alex Magaisa, who was at Kent University in the UK then, to come and head that technical team. And we resourced that technical team, and it became available to those who were anchoring the process of developing a new constitution, to the extent that Alex Magaisa ends up becoming one of the core drafters of the constitution.
Yeah.
So if we are to talk about legacy and contribution, one of the biggest contributions that this Zimbabwe Alliance collaborative framework that we mooted and worked on was on the new constitution that Zimbabwe has today, which is significantly more progressive in terms of rights protection, women's rights, social economic rights, political rights, checks and balances. That was one of the biggest contributions that we were able to bring. I must also mention to you, Becky, that we do have, I think it's 7 chapters of a book that Alex Magaisa then wrote as part of that experience that I still believe
it should be published,
needs to see the light of the day and should be published one way or the other. Unfortunately, we've lost Alex now, but that work is unperishable. It's still there.
Yeah, in fact, I wanted us to, to pay tribute to Alex. Alex used to be a very close colleague to us, to you, myself, and many others in the field. And like you said, he, not only did he end up being part of the drafting team, but he ended up being the advisor to the Prime Minister. So you can see some of the impact that some of those grants made. So I think it would be fair for us and to find a way in which we can actually make these last chapters of his work to see the light of the day. I suspect we might have to speak to the family. But yeah, we lost a very good friend, a very good professor, somebody who has contributed immensely to the struggle of Zimbabwe. And it was all through the Zim Alliance that we actually ended up having such. And I mean, you probably are very humble to talk about your role there, because a lot of these things were happening in something called the inclusive bar.
I know. By the time I moved back to Zim, Becky, coming from Ohio, having studied economics, and then it was Ohio, Washington, D.C., there's something that I knew. And it was that the most progressive communities, societies, are societies that had a social space where people could come and connect, interact, relax, brainstorm, dream together, share aspirations, and all of that. So when I came to Zim, it was my commitment to create such a space. And as you are saying, I ended up creating the Inclusive Bar, which became a social space where a lot of people have come through, including people like Alex Magaisa, a lot of our political actors, a lot of our civic leaders have had their own time to come and interact, and inclusivity was at the center of it. It didn't need to be people that were wearing the same party t-shirt with you, but you just needed to be in a space, a social space, relaxed, informal, would loosely structure the conversations, but would really have very important insights. So the Inclusive Bar became one of those spaces where Alex would come, would interact. You've come to the Inclusive Bar. I could name a lot of names here that have come through the Inclusive Bar.
So another track which I think is interesting for me, and like I said, we're hoping to write a full case study, is that of the arts, because when I met you, I didn't know that actually you are partly artistic, and some of the grants ended up in the arts. I remember vividly going to Book Cafe, and there were several times that we would go there, but there was this one moment where we had all sorts of artists, musicians, painters, drummers. And I saw one of the most interesting things in my life, where somebody would be playing music and others would be painting, but inspired by by the music. And then, of course, we took that to another level where you would have groups like Magamba and others, even Yanema from Senegal, performing at World Social Forums, etc., etc. And so at that point, I also discovered that you can rap.
Yes. So it's a very important track that you are bringing in. Because we were very deliberate at the very beginning of Zim Alliance to say we were not only going to work towards mobilization of resources, increasing the flow of resources to Zimbabwe, but we also wanted to increase the flow of resources to groups that were normally marginalized, but that in our view we believed were very important for the social transformation agenda. So young people in general were very important in that regard. Young women and women in general were very important in that regard. Groups that were called out of the beltway that would not appear normally on the radar of big funders were very important in that regard. And for us, arts organizations were extremely important in that regard in terms of inspiring the whole movement for change. So as you mentioned, Pamberi Trust at that point became one of our very important partners. And we can go into the details because it was a story of both success and failure. But they became a very important partner in terms of, so some of the, what you are citing is the experience we had at the book cafe. Pamberi Trust used to run the book cafe. So we would partner with them to bring, to promote local artists in the country to come and express themselves, speak to the issues of change, because we believed that arts and culture would change society faster than politics would in general, but also do it in a very inspiring way, in a very authentic way, in a very rooted way, in a way that connected to the best of our instincts, that connected to the deeper wells of what brings out the best in us. So it was really an extremely important endeavor for us. So we brought groups like Positive Black Souls, Didi Awadi from Senegal to come and perform. We even supported the Haifa Harare International Festival of Arts, bringing artists, local artists, and we created projects. We had a huge project that we called Create, Inspire, Change, where we're bringing all these artists into these conversations. We're doing so many things. At one point, it was just capturing headlines and curating walls through the headlines over the years, and they're nicely framed and curated into space and stuff. So that was extremely important for us. It's even up to date, it's one of the most important work that we've done in Zimbabwe. It's around the arts and culture space. And you mentioned Magamba network early on. So Zim Alliance was a pioneering investor into Magamba as a very nascent concept and idea, not even a fully formed organization in terms of, do you have a board, do you have audited reports, do you have all of this? We just saw that these were driven, committed, inspired
artists,
young people centering arts and culture, and later on, civic technology and everything into this whole idea of driving democratic change and social transformation. And they were actually one of the early beneficiaries of Zim Alliance, to the extent that when you're talking about case studies and stuff, especially as we build towards the next African Philanthropy Conference, that's one of the very important stories. I was just at Magamba's strategic planning. I gave a keynote maybe a month or so ago at their strategic planning convening. It was 40 people in that room. When we were working and investing in Magamba at that time, it was probably two, three people. This time it was 40 people. really moving and shaking things across the continent, in programs in 7 countries, and like very innovative programming.
Yeah.
So those were some of the interventions that really speak to Zim Alliance legacy.
I think, some of those artists that were supported, some of them are now big, national musicians now. I mean, I don't want to mention names. One of them is a close friend of mine now, Dazadi.
Yes.
So, but anyway, another stream of work that I think is also important to highlight is the stream around the campaign on debt. Because the support to Zim Code and others, in a way, has led to what you are now at TrustAfrica working on, Stop the Bleeding campaign. So maybe we can talk a bit about that stream of work there.
Yeah, no, very. So as I said from the very onset, we knew there was the civil liberties, democratic rights dimension, but there was also the social economic justice dimension. And we saw immediately that not just Zimbabwe alone, but African countries in general, were spending a huge proportion of their national fiscus servicing debts. And these were debts that had been accrued in very dubious manners, and some of them were debts with a historical colonial legacy. So debts that were actually accrued to oppress people, but are now being paid by our governments, and being part of why we can no longer invest in education, in healthcare, in housing, in infrastructure, in all these basic services that we communities need. So we picked that up as a very, very important campaign, and when we were drilling deeper into it, it became clear to us that it's not just historical date. But there were also now new ways in which we were losing resources and wealth from the continent, particularly through illicit financial flows. And the numbers are staggering. We're talking of about $100 billion leaving the African continent every year through illicit financial flows. And the biggest perpetrator in that situation is the multinational corporations operating on the continent, especially those that are operating in the natural resources sector. And there are all these very sophisticated ways through which they can avoid paying their fair share of taxation. And a lot of it is not illegal, it's just illicit. But at the end of the day, it means wealth leaves the African continent. There's a net outflow of wealth from the continent to the global north, and we are left impoverished. So that motivated us to really invest in a big campaign and to be at the center of founding what's known now as the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, that brings some of the foremost Pan-African organizations working on these issues, including a Tax Justice Network in Africa, Afrodad, FemNet. We've got NAWI now, we've got International Trade Union Council, Africa, and Pan-African Lawyers Union to really build a movement to curtail and stop illicit financial flows from the continent. Can you imagine what is possible if we are to stop this $100 billion from leaving the continent? In 10 years, it means $1 trillion. And this, by far, dwarfs what we need to solve issues around financing just energy transition, financing for climate change, financing for education, financing for health, financing for housing, and some of the basic needs that we have on the continent.
So I think there's a confluence here at some point where TrustAfrica was also beginning to do economic governance, and the time that Zim Alliance was already doing that kind of work. And of course, we could speak at length about the work that we did with your Tax Justice Network, Afrodad, Third World Network, among others, with that very first set of grants that we actually gave at that time. But I want us to go back a bit to some of the, you mentioned success and failure, and there's one particular grant that I normally want to talk about. You already know.
I know.
So what did we learn from that part of our early grant making to Zimbabwe, and one of the grants was to Pamberi Trust, and we had a grand idea which came from you, obviously, to build an NGO house, which would become a center for most of the impoverished and out of let's say city-based organizations that would not have space to hold meetings or do their. And so the idea was, here is a building that Pamberi Trust has. It's been donated to them, and they want to use it for this idea where it can become a big NGO space. And that was early on, before many groups actually thought about doing NGO spaces, and now we have got so many of them across the continent. I know that for me, that was one of the best ways in which I learned grant making. I don't know what your take was. I mean, we can talk a bit about that.
No, the idea was brilliant, and it's still to be done in Zimbabwe. As you said, this is a shared space. Now people are talking of co-working space. This is way before that language had even been created. So this was not just a co-working space, but it was a space where we will have a studio for artists to come and record and do rehearsal studios. We would have graphics design studios. We'll have printing space where, as you know, in movements and organizing, you're always printing flyers, posters, and everything. You'll have that in the space. You'll have the traditional, co-working arrangements. But so it wasn't just even that groups that normally do not have access, but we're also creating a space for them to be in proximity with each other, and they're interacting and they're building solidarity. So to me, it's still one of the most brilliant ideas that we came up with.
It was actually where I had it was before we had the WeWorks concept.
Where it was
the WeWorks and the NGO
oh my God, Becky, I wanted to mention WeWorks because that's now what WeWorks has done. But this was our concept at that particular time: full, comprehensive, one-stop shop. Shared space for social change leaders, progressive activists, different movements. I mean, it was just incredible. And
but it didn't happen.
If you are asking, what I learned from that, so we invested a lot of money in it. In the Zimbabwe context, certainly we invested $150,000 into that project. And Pamberi Trust was an ideal and attractive partner for us because they already had a multiple-story building that was completely dilapidated, but in the city. And we also had a vision for the rejuvenation of the city. So we saw the building as potentially becoming the starting point of what would become a rejuvenation of that whole area in terms of creating vibrance, progressive spaces, arts and culture, and everything. So we partnered at that level, and I think the reason why things did not work out in the end is that our partner was already having very significant challenges centered around what then became the demise of the founding leader of Pamberi Trust. As you know, Paul Briggs, who was running Pamberi Trust there, completely honorable person, war veteran, one of the very few white war veterans in the country. And they started Pamberi Trust through the demobilization pay that they got as veterans. Then they put that money together to create this space, arts, culture, books, and all of that. But at that point, I think the institution was having very serious problems. So maybe a shortcoming on our end was to not go into the final due diligence to really understand where the institution was. We were just so driven and inspired by the passion and the idea. So it can tell you that passion is not is not enough. Even inspiration is not enough. Good ideas are not enough. I think some of the kind of hard nuts and bolts, especially for projects that involve capital investments at this magnitude, where you are constructing things. You met the manager. I remember you coming for one of the visits to check on progress and meeting with the manager of the project at that particular time, and you're asking me a question that you think this manager needs construction himself or to be managed. You were not convinced that they were up to the task.
Yeah, but we learned a lot there. So the first for me was that when maybe as a grant maker, if you are investing in something that involves massive construction, capital expenditures, like you say, infrastructure revamp, it is always important to have maybe a specialist in-house who can also advise on things that go into it, because we didn't know. We're actually driven by the idea, and we're loving it, and we trusted that the partner had specialization, only to be told that all the money had gone underground.
Yes.
Which could have been true. Actually, it could have been true that actually the renovations underground costed that kind of money. But had we done some kind of a feasibility study and assessment, we would have known the price that it would have cost us to actually revamp that building. So that was the first. The second lesson for me was that in grant making, you are not always going to be successful. Some grants are going to just be good for lesson learning. And that grant set us up for actually knowing how to deal with other grants that were coming up and going to be problematic. And this is where you now, in a way, get to be fully immersed in TrustAfrica. I remember at some point asking you to go and sort out a grantee in Ghana. But the point I'm making is that I think for me that was one of the best times of my grant making time, because I really had to learn a lot. And also, Akwasi, as you spoke about him at that point, we thought he's probably going to be so pissed because of the failure that we did with the grant. But actually, he just said, learn from it and let's improve going forward. And that's how the whole thing ended. And in a way, grant making is an art, but it's also a science. It is also a process of learning and sharing. So I know that we might be running out of time now, but I want us to get to the final part, because I think the story of TrustAfrica is kind of captured in different ways. We've done an episode with Hebrima, we've done an episode with Akwasi, but you are currently the director of programs, and there are two initiatives I want us to end with. So the first is the work around social movements. You've been instrumental in trying to bring together different leaders that work in different communities under the banner of social movements in Africa. Can we speak briefly about what the objective of the program is, and maybe paint a journey from the first Baraza to the one that is coming up in November this year in Nairobi?
No, it's actually a very good segue into what is really the passion, current passion of my life. And the interesting part is that it connects to the Zim Alliance legacy. We convened the very first African social movements Baraza in Zimbabwe, 2018. And at that point, we gathered leading social movements from several African countries, Senegal, Burkina Faso, so we're talking of your Yenama, your Citoyen in Burkina Faso, Lucha in DRC, Power 254 then, people like Boniface Mwangi in Kenya, and we convened these movements in Zimbabwe in 2018 with a desire to create a platform where we would all come together for mutual learning, for building solidarity, for sharing resources, sharing strategies, sharing tactics, and having really critical conversations in terms of how do we move forward as a collective. And I think coming to where we are now, as TrustAfrica, we really believe that social movements are a critical force for social change. Because particularly of their investment or their capacities for mass mobilization, capacities for organizing at a local level, organizing in communities, for their capacities to mobilize collective action, but very importantly, for the commitment and conviction that change takes building a social base. Sustainable change takes building a social base. So it's one thing to have change that is driven by a few policymakers sitting in a room, and it's a completely different color of change if you are to have change that is inspired, anchored, driven by a broad social base. So we've been, since 2018, we organized the follow-up social movements Baraza in Johannesburg, actually, 2 years ago. And we brought, at that point, more than 20 African countries, movements from more than 20 African countries, and we also brought very important funders for movements, because we're now looking at, okay, what are those critical issues that we need to look at when it comes to strengthening the organizing capacity for social movements, when it comes to strengthening social movements. So we had a lot of things come out of the Baraza that we did 2 years ago here in Johannesburg, including bringing to the fore the centrality of political education, particularly political education that connects to some of the traditions and insights of the best of our movements, your Jubilee, anti-debt movements that we know, the anti-neoliberal movements that we know, bringing the traditions around teach-ins, around summer schools, activist schools into the space. We had very big insights coming up in terms of cross-movement solidarity, to say how do we connect movements in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, in Zimbabwe, so that movements are standing together. In Swaziland, you are not on your own. And in fact, one of the important participants at the last Baraza was our comrade Tulani Maseko, who got murdered by the Swaz regime a few months after that. And we had sat down to discuss solidarity and everything. And we continue to be in touch with comrades around building solidarity at that point. So, strengthening certain capacities, but also the question of how do funders work with movements was at the center, as you would be aware. So we've convened these conversations between movements and funders to say, how do we build trust, understanding, and how do we move to a place of better approaches and formulations towards funding movements that are more centered in solidarity and less, alien templates. So now we are moving into the next African Social Movements Baraza, which is going to be held in Nairobi from the 20th to the 22nd of November. And it's going to be themed around the power of movements. And for us, it's an extremely significant moment because we are going to be gathering 56 African countries at this Baraza to have an important conversation on what we see as the most important questions of our time. We know that answers that are going to be given to these critical questions right now will define humanity's future for the next 50 years and beyond. Even the rulers of the world currently have accepted that we have reached the end of a historical cycle where we need new answers on democracy, on economics, on global governance, on global financial architecture. We are hearing conversations about the reforming the UN, the summit of the future. Everything is changing at this particular moment. And we are saying we need to center movements in giving answers to all these questions so that we do not have elitist answers that leave the people behind.
Yeah.
And some of these answers are being proposed from people who are responsible for the ideas that have taken us to this moment of peril when it comes to climate change, when it comes to all these challenges that the world is confronted with today.
Yeah.
So we are saying let's center movements and the collective agents of movements in the process of providing answers. So the next baraza is coming up, 56 African countries, looking at the power of movements, looking at examples of how movements have organized and already demonstrated this capacity for social change in everything from advancing gender justice to environmental rights, advancing civil rights, defending, renewing, advancing democracy. So it's going to be a really big moment in our view of gathering all of these activists, and at the same time also bringing in the dimension of then what is the best way for philanthropy to partner with movements.
Yeah. So I think that's a good segue to us talking about the next stream of work, which I think is a very special initiative that TrustAfrica and the Agent Action Fund have actually put in place. You recently came back from the US where you were meeting different actors and movements around a new fund that the two institutions have put together. And again, there's been a process around that. Maybe let's talk a bit about that, the Pan-Africanist Feminist Philanthropy Fund, which now is a new name, right?
It's now, we call it Harambee Ubuntu Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropies.
Yeah.
And obviously Harambee speaks to the lifting together. Ubuntu speaks to our solidarity, reciprocity. I am because you are, which is at the heart of giving traditions particularly in our African context. And with that, again connected to this characterization and reading of the moment as this most decisive moment in history for us, we are saying we need to mobilize massive resources and we need to shift the philanthropic space to significantly, demonstrably better ways of giving. So that we are supporting movements to be at the center of driving and defining change at this particular time. So that's what the initiative is focusing on. We are aiming to mobilize $1 billion over the next 10 years. And we are also aiming so we are aiming to build this endowment that will then support movements and Pan-African and feminist philanthropies. We are also aiming to contribute towards shifting the narratives around philanthropy itself.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that you are familiar with, CAPS is championing, TrustAfrica has been very much involved in to build on our traditions of giving already as African communities and our knowledge and our remembrance that philanthropy is not just about money. It's about us giving our time, it's about us giving our talents, it's about various forms of capital, our networks, our knowledge, our different forms of capital, mobilizing all of that. And also philanthropy is not just about institutions. It's really about individuals, it's about collectives, it's about communities, it's about just nurturing resources in our communities. So we have a serious commitment towards reframing the narratives around African giving and around African philanthropy connected to this. So when we were in the US recently, part of this, we're looking at it as a roadshow. Obviously to mobilize resources for this, but at the same time to begin to have this conversation. And I want to share something that was very significant in terms of my reflections. The very first meeting we did in the US was with Movement for Black Lives. And Movement for Black Lives goes all the way back to 2014, I think, when they were organizing in Ferguson against police brutality and the murder of black people by the police in the US. It became a movement that really caught fire and has continued to what we saw with the George Floyd moment in Minneapolis. And what we were able to learn from how they were organizing there is how they have taken this to local communities and really organizing around critical issues that are affecting black people in terms of mass incarceration, access to education, access to employment, systemic racism, and they've been able to build this massive social base, this very visible movement that everyone can actually look at. And we have seen that it's become impossible to ignore that social base to the extent that it has shifted their conversations with political actors, it has shifted their conversations with philanthropy. When they go in to engage philanthropy, they have a completely different narrative from what you'd normally meet even here on the continent. They're actually saying, look, this is the reality of black oppression, of the war against black people in communities in the US. Where do you stand? What is your investment in the agenda for black liberation? If you are committed to social justice and transformation, what is your commitment? So we've actually seen them engaging from that level, which is not a level of begging, or it's actually a very principled conversation that they are having with philanthropy. And you've seen that contributing to shifting philanthropy from these very high horses to actually saying, okay, how can we be a solidarity partner on this agenda for transformation? And the latest thing that we've seen them beginning to talk about is on corporate reparations, where they are actually looking at different corporations and say, you are complicit, you have been complicit in the exploitation of black communities and black bodies, and that's how you have built your wealth. And where are the reparations so that we can begin to address the systemic issues that we are seeing in terms of injustices that are being expressed by the black community. So there's a lot that can come up in terms of a conversation between especially the racial justice movement, the African diaspora social movements in the US, and African social movements in the US, in terms of really learning from each other on tactics, on strategies, on narratives around advancing towards these shared goals and this shared agenda for transformation.
So I want us to land on a futuristic note and possibly a positive note, which is that this room is full of young people, and you have recently been working on a new project focusing on youth in Africa. Maybe let's land on that note, talking to young people within the framework of the work that you do.
Yes, we just launched a partnership that is looking at setting up what we are calling youth panels, and initially it's going to be in 10 African countries, panels of 20 up to 30 young people, to really tap into their thinking, their dreams, their aspirations, their anxieties, their fears when it comes to desirable futures. So it's really aligned to this notion of shaping the future we want for Africa. And if you look at the demographic dynamics on the continent, with this continent being young and becoming even more young in these next decades that are coming up, we really are committed ourselves to centering the voices of young people in the shaping of the future that we want, for the continent. So this initiative is in 10 African countries, beginning to tap into, where young people are, what their thinking is, and we have been fortunate enough to, secure the partnership of, our friends and colleagues at MasterCard Foundation to really look at how do we collectively support young people to speak to their aspirations, their dreams, their hopes about the futures that they want, including around this question of dignified and fulfilling work. For us, it really speaks to our belief that young people are the present, if you look at our demographics, but they are also the future for this continent. And their voices must be at the center of shaping that future.
So Briggs, finally, that camera, you as Programs Director at TrustAfrica has a whole team, Southern Africa Trust, the Africa Philanthropy Forum, the Africa Philanthropy Network, the East Africa Philanthropy Network, and potentially several others, including CAPSI, are going to be hosting our 5th African Philanthropy Conference in Victoria Falls. Can you take a minute and advertise the conference? Right there.
Come to Victoria Falls, 29 July to the 2nd of August this year for the 5th African Philanthropy Conference. The theme is on African philanthropy, the next frontier. We are really looking at how do we make African philanthropy relevant to this particular global political moment and this agenda of centering African agency in shaping the future of the continent and the future of the world for the next 50 years. There's going to be leading social change leaders from across the continent and beyond, and it is the space to be. So come and join us. 29 July to the 2nd of August, Victoria Falls. You can already go on the website, www.africanphilanthropyconference.org, to get a lot more information, propose sessions. But this is going to be a very, very significant space and conversation. So come and join us.
On that note, thank you so much, Briggs. That was Briggs John Bomba, the founding coordinator of the Zim Alliance, and currently the Programs Director at TrustAfrica. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.